Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and in today's episode we're going to be reviewing and breaking down The Maze Runner, both the original novel by James Dashner and a 2014 movie adaptation. In this episode we're going to be looking at the story itself, the characters, the world building, the themes, and most importantly, what the movie changed from the book. This is the first book in the Maze Runner series and it throws you into the world with almost no explanation. We're following Thomas, a teenage boy who wakes up in an elevator with absolutely no memory except for his name. He arrives in a strange place called the Glade, surrounded by enormous stone walls that open every morning into a deadly maze. And just like Thomas, the reader basically has no idea what's going on. In this episode, we're covering the premise, who it's for, what to expect, characters, standout moments, themes, book versus movie, what works, what doesn't, and a final verdict. And here's a warning, there's going to be spoilers for both the book and the movie from this point forward, so I would highly recommend reading the book before watching this. This book and movie is really good for readers who like dystopian stories with mystery at the center. And I would say it's good for fans of The Hunger Games or Divergent looking for another young adult survival series. It's good for people who like stories where the characters have to figure out the rules of their world alongside the audience. And it's good for readers who enjoy ensemble casts rather than one character doing everything. It's good for fans of survival stories, secret experiments, conspiracies, and what is actually going on mysteries. The movie is especially good for people who want the basic story and action without all of the book's internal mystery. The book is better, however, for readers who want to spend more time inside Thomas's confusion and paranoia. And you're dropped into the story with almost no explanation. Thomas doesn't remember his past, and everyone in the glade has also lost their memories. The glade is surrounded by four massive walls, and beyond these walls is the maze. The maze changes every night. The maze is filled with grievers, terrifying mechanical and biological creatures designed to hunt the gladers. The boys have created an entire society with jobs, rules, rankings, and routines, and every month another boy arrives to the box. However, something happens that something has never happened before, and a girl arrives. Her name is Teresa, and she's apparently connected to Thomas, as listed in the box. Most importantly, she's the last person who's supposed to arrive, and it says that in a note in the box. The story gradually changes from survive the maze to figure out why the maze exists. And Thomas basically wakes up in a box with no memories, and the elevator brings him to a place. In the elevator brings him to a place called the Glade, and that's basically how it all starts in both the book and the movie. He's surrounded by dozens of teenage boys who have been trapped there for years, and every morning the massive doors leading to the maze open. Every night they close, and the runners are responsible for entering the maze during the day and mapping it. The goal is to find an escape route, and that's what everybody wants to do. But nobody has been able to solve the maze. Thomas immediately feels like he's supposed to be a runner, but then Teresa arrives. Her arrival changes the rules. The maze starts behaving differently, and the grievers start appearing at unusual times. Then the Gladers realize the system they've been living under is beginning to collapse, and now I'm going to be talking about some of the main points. First is Thomas waking up in the box, and this immediately creates the I know nothing and neither is the main character feeling. Then we have a first look at the Glade, and it's weirdly peaceful compared to the horror surrounding it, which is just a vast, large field with structures all around it where people live and things like that. Then the maze doors closing, and one of the most effective recurring moments because everyone knows exactly what happens if you're caught outside the maze, and it's pretty terrifying, and it's kind of like a nightmare, so no one wants to go out except for the brave runners. Speaking of the runners, this is the idea of teenagers voluntarily entering a deadly maze even every day to map it, and it's instantly compelling because it sounds pretty adventurous and fun, but also terrifying and something new. Now I'm going to be talking a little bit about the characters. We first have Minho, and he quickly becomes one of the most popular characters because he's confident, sarcastic, capable, and doesn't completely trust Thomas. Then comes Albie, the leader whose history and relationship with the maze becomes increasingly important. Then let's talk about Newt. He's probably the emotional glue of the Gladers. And the youngest one, Chuck, and he's the younger kid who becomes attached to Thomas. And finally, we have Gally, and he's a character who seems completely unreasonable at first, but actually represents the fear of changing the system. And another moment is Thomas entering the maze, and it's one of the biggest turning points because he breaks one of the most important rules almost immediately. Then comes Thomas and Minho trapped overnight to a result as a result of that. And the movie especially turns this into one of its biggest action sequences. And then the Grievers, one of the most memorable creature concepts in young adult dystopian fiction. And they're pretty terrifying, and they're basically really, really big creatures who attack you. Then comes Teresa's arrival, and because she's not just another Glader, she seems to know Thomas. Then comes the everything is about to change, is going to change moment. Her arrival signals that the entire experiment is entering a new phase. And this brings us to the changing. Characters who survive a Griever sting temporarily recover memories, giving everyone else clues about what happened before the Glade. Then Thomas remembers pieces of his past, and the revelation that he may have been connected to the people who created the maze completely changes how we view him as a little bit of like a bad character instead of the main good character we usually see. Then comes the maze code, and this is the realization that the maze isn't random and that the maps contain a hidden message that could possibly help them escape. Then the final puzzle, the Gladers finally realize that the maze itself is essentially a giant puzzle. Then the fake ending. This is the realization that escaping the maze doesn't mean they're actually free. Instead, it's the start to something really big that could lead them into future books and series. Now I'm going to be talking a little bit about the characters. We first have Thomas, the protagonist, and our way into the story. He's curious, impulsive, stubborn, and constantly willing to break rules if he thinks there's a chance to escape. His biggest strength is that he refuses to accept that that's just how things are. This immediately puts him into conflict with Gally, and Thomas is also interested because he gradually discovers that he may have been involved with the Wicked before the maze. This creates a moral question. If Thomas helped create the system that's now hurting him, does that change how we see him? And obviously, there's an answer, and it varies for all the readers. His relationship with Teresa is also complicated because they share memories and a connection that nobody else understands, and it really dates back to before the maze and maybe even the creation, and we see later on. Then comes Teresa, and she's the only girl in the glade. She arrives with the message that she's the last one, and she has a mysterious connection to Thomas. She's much more important to the larger mystery than she initially appears, and the movie simplifies some of her book characterization, making her more directly involved in the action. In the book, her connection to Thomas and telepathic communication between them is much more prominent than in the movie, and because the book is a better way to communicate this. Then we have Newt, and he's the second in command of the Glade. He's calm, empathetic, and much more willing to listen to Thomas. He often functions as the emotional center of the group, and he's one of the few characters that can understand both Thomas's perspective and the concerns of the older Gladers. His relationship with Thomas becomes one of the strongest friendships. His relationship with Thomas becomes one of the strongest friendships in the arena, and it's a really great relationship, and he lasts till the end. Then we have Mino, who is the keeper of the runners, and he's really brave, sarcastic, and extremely competent. And he's one of the first characters who proves that surviving the maze requires skill rather than just courage. His relationship with Thomas develops through mutual respect, and the movie gives him a particularly strong action presence because he's trapped in the maze with Thomas, and that gives him a little bit more of a little bit bigger of a chance to develop his character. Then we have Albie, and he's the leader of the Gladers, and he has been in the maze longer than almost anyone else. He's one of the first, and he's witnessed everything, and he wants stability because he's seen what happens when people panic. And his resistance to Thomas isn't necessarily because he hates him; it's because Thomas represents change, and change is terrifying when the existing system is the only thing keeping people alive. Then we have Gally, Thomas's biggest early antagonist, and he's completely convinced that the Glades rules exist for a reason, and he sees Thomas as reckless and dangerous, and his character becomes more interesting when you realize that he's basically reacting to trauma, and he doesn't necessarily believe that the Glade is good, and instead he's just a little bit nervous and just wants to survive, and he believes that breaking the rules is worse. Then we have the youngest character and most beloved, Chuck, and he's the youngest major Glader. He quickly becomes attached to Thomas and provides some humor in an otherwise extremely tense story. And his friendship with Thomas is important because Thomas begins to see the Glade as a community rather than simply a puzzle, like a family, and his fate becomes one of the most emotional moments of the story, which makes it hit a little bit more deeper and harder when we see these characters passing away or whatever happens to them later on. Now I'm going to be talking about some of the themes. The first theme and the major theme is memory and identity. And this is the most obvious theme in the book, and every character has lost their memories. The story asks whether your identity comes from your memories or from the choices you make now. And Thomas doesn't know who he was in the past, so this is really one of the biggest themes in the book. And this really this is important because we know that Teresa is connected to Thomas in the book, and they could be like to their work for a wicked or more than that. And if you don't remember doing something, are you still responsible for it? And he discovers that his connection to Wicked is even deeper when he sees Teresa. Then comes the second theme of control versus free will. The Gladers think that they're making their own choices, but almost everything about their environment has been designed. Their memories were taken and their location was chosen, and so was basically everything else. And the maze has been built, and there's multiple more mazes. If you at the end of the movie you see that, and and everything was constructed based on how they were going to experiment them. The maze were constructed, the grievers were built, their reactions were being monitored, and even their escape was a part of the experiment. The biggest horror isn't the maze, but it's realizing that someone designed the entire experience specifically to manipulate them. And then that brings me to the next point as or theme as fear as a tool. The Gladers are controlled largely through fear. The maze, the grievers, the changing walls that change all the time and don't provide a clear way to escape, the rules and the threat of becoming a griever's victim. And Galley's character shows that fear can cause people to cling to systems even when those systems are hurting them. Thomas's defining characteristics is that he's willing to act despite the fear. And then comes the next theme of leadership. Albie, Newt, Thomas, and Galley represent completely different leadership styles. Albie prioritizes stability, Newt prioritizes cooperation, Thomas prioritizes action and discovery, and Galley prioritizes rules. None of these approaches are completely wrong, and the becomes interesting because the Gladers need different types of leadership at different moments when it really comes to that point. The next part is sacrifice. The story repeatedly asks what people are willing to risk for other people. Thomas runs into the maze for Albie. Mina refuses to abandon Thomas, and the Gladers eventually have to decide whether to stay together or escape. Chuck's relationship with Thomas makes the final sacrifice particularly painful. And in this book and movie, survival isn't just about staying alive, but it's about instead deciding whose life you're willing to risk your own for. And we see a lot of this. Now let's talk about the maze. The maze essentially another character in the story. It changes every night, the walls move, the paths shift, the maps are constantly changing, and the runners spend months trying to understand it. The important realization is that the maze isn't just a physical challenge, but instead it's a puzzle. The Gladers have been collecting pieces of the answer without realizing what they're actually looking at, and the movie makes the maze much more visually spectacular. The book spends more time explaining the process of mapping it and analyzing it, which is pretty good for people who like puzzles and figuring out how to solve things. And the movie is good for adventurers. People really want to see that action in real play. The book's version feels more like a mystery, and the movie's version feels more like a action horror environment. Now let's talk about Wicked. Wicked is arguably the most important concept introduced in the first book. The Gladers initially think that they're trapped in a random nightmare, but eventually they realize that everything is intentional. Wicked has placed them there as a part of an experiment, and everyone has different types of leaderships and personalities, which is what Wicked wants to analyze to see how they respond in situations like emergencies or things like that. The organization claims that what they're doing is necessary to understand the flare and eventually save humanity, but this creates one of the biggest moral questions in the entire series. Can doing something horrific be justified if the end goal is to save humanity? The book doesn't give us the complete answer, and that's part of what makes the reveal work. And the mystery of Wicked becomes much bigger in the later books, and there's a lot more lore if you want to explore more than just a movie or book. Speaking of that, let's see the book versus movie. Here's what the movie gets right. The basic premise remains intact. Thomas still arrives in the box with no memories. It's kind of intense. The Glade and the maze are visually faithful to the basic concept. The runners are still central. The grievers are brought to life extremely effectively. Thomas, Newt, Minho, Albie, Gally, Chuck, and Teresa all retain their basic roles. The movie captures a claustrophobic feeling of being trapped, and the maze look exactly like the kind of place you've never want to enter. Dylan O'Brien gives Thomas a more action-oriented personality, and the movie makes the danger more immediate. The final escape is much more cinematic and physically intense and action-packed, which is what most readers wanted. And here's what the movie changes. The first one is Thomas' personality. In the book, Thomas is more confused, analytical, and internally focused. In the movie, Thomas is more immediately rebellious and action oriented. The movie turns him into a more traditional young adult action protagonist, and this makes the movie easier to follow. But it also loses some of the book's psychological uncertainty, which is what I think the author was aiming towards. Now comes Teresa. One of the biggest changes in the book and movie. In the book, Thomas and Teresa communicate telepathically, and their connection is a huge part of the mystery. The movie largely removes this element. Instead, Teresa becomes more physically involved in the action. This makes the movie work better visually, but removes one of the stranger and more distinctive aspects of the book. Then comes the maze. The book treats the maze like a giant puzzle. However, the movie focuses more on the maze as a physical threat. The movie spends more time on running, fighting, and escaping, while the book spends time on mapping. This is probably the biggest tonal difference between the two versions. Now let's talk about the grievers. The book's grievers are horrifying because they're difficult to understand. The movie makes them more recognizable as physical monsters, which I think it did a much better job on. The movie's version is more action oriented, but both versions work because the grievers represent the consequences of breaking the rules and what they can do in reality. Then comes the final escape. The basic concept is similar, but the movie changes the sequence of events and increases the action, and it's packed a lot more. The book is more focused on the puzzle and the relevation behind it, and the movie is more focused on survival. Now let's talk about the ending. Both versions reveal that the maze was an experiment. Both suggest that Wicked was is responsible. However, the movie makes the reveal much more direct and cinematic. The book leaves more unanswered questions, and the ambiguity is important because the series is ultimately built around the mystery of Wicked. Now, the biggest book to movie difference is that the book is fundamentally a mystery, and the book is fundamentally an action thriller because it's a really big difference. And I guess it makes sense because you would watch a movie for the action and the picture, but you would read a book just for the visualization or the captivate or just to be captivated by the book. The book constantly asks what is happening, why are we here, and who can we trust. The movie asks, how do we get out, how do we survive, and what's chasing us. Neither approach is necessarily better, but they're just trying to create different experiences, which is good because it creates a little bit of a difference. Because if you've already watched the movie, you wouldn't want to read the same thing in the book. Here's what the movie improves: the pacing, the visual storytelling, the action, the maze itself, the grievers, making the story accessible to people who haven't read the book, and also creating immediate tension. And me personally, I watched the movie first, so reading the book was a little bit less, let's say, intriguing, but they were still pretty good, both combined. And here's what the book does better: it has much more mystery, it has Thomas's internal conflict shown better. It also shows Teresa's connection to Thomas, which really doesn't happen in the movie. The maze solving process, the psychological effects of memory loss, the gradual realization that the gladers are just being manipulated, the weirdness of the world, and it's making you feel as confused as Thomas, which is something that the movie couldn't have done better than the book. And here's what the movie loses: it loses some of the book's stranger ideas and what could have been expanded into more of like a lore building or a little bit of more of the person watching the thought processes. It loses more detailed character relationships, much of the telepathic communications between Thomas and Teresa, some of the slower mystery building, and the feeling that you're slowly solving the maze alongside the characters. And I really like that in the book, and I really wish they would have shown that in the movie. However, that would have been a little bit more of like a scavenger hunt and not like figuring out the mazes. Anyways, here's what the book loses. It loses some of the immediacy, the visual spectacle, and the physical scale of the maze, and it just makes it feel kind of like an escape room that they're trying to escape. But I feel like both of them combined as a really strong combination because it shows the world properly. It also loses the intensity of the Griever sequences, the ability to immediately show how terrifying the environment is. Because, as I said, the maze was really big in the movie, and when I read the book, it just felt kind of smaller. So, here's my personal take. I think that the book is better as a mystery, while the movie is better as an action story. The book makes you feel trapped alongside Thomas, and I would recommend that if you are more of a mystery person and you don't want to do both, read the book. But if you're more of like an action person and like seeing it as a visual and a visual learner, or someone who likes movies more, I'd recommend watching the movie. But however, I would highly recommend watching both if you have the time and want to. And the movie makes you feel like you're watching the characters desperately trying to escape. And the movie is really that type of thing that anybody can really watch. You can watch it with your family, someone older. You can watch it with anyone, except that I would say don't watch it with younger children, as this is a young adult book and series, and I would highly recommend watching it with someone above the age of 12 or someone older than that. However, it's up to you and it's up to the mature person. I prefer the book when it comes to mystery surrounding Wicked and the maze, but the movie does an excellent job of translating an internal, confusing story into something visually exciting. Dylan O'Brien is also a huge reason the movie works. His version of Thomas has more immediate charisma and keeps the movie a strong central performance. The biggest thing I wish the movie had kept is the telepathic communication between Thomas and Teresa, and that element makes their relationship much stranger and more important in the book. At the same time, I understand why the movie removed it, as visually telepathically communicating would have been easily made the book feel overly complicated. And the best part of both the versions is that they have the same idea. One, the characters think they're trying to escape a maze, and two, they're actually trapped inside of someone else's experiment. So if you're watching the movie first, like me, definitely read the book afterward because it gives you a little bit more of an insight. The book gives you much more content about the characters and the experiment. However, if you're watching the book first, definitely don't skip the movie and don't expect the movie to be a scene for scene adaptation, and pay attention to the differences in the relationship. So overall, I would really rate the book a 4.5 out of 5. It has strong mystery, great concept, excellent atmosphere, memorable characters, and some confusing terminology and pacing issues. However, the central mystery is strong enough to carry the story. And I would really say that the book really emphasized on the mystery and the thought process behind that. So that was great, and it gave me a lot of thinking time to really absorb in and soak what it was. I would rate the movie a 4 or a 4.1 or 2 out of 5, and it's a great adaptation of the basic concept. It has excellent action and visuals, strong performances, very exceptional and effective grievers in the maze. But however, it simplifies some of the book's more interesting psychological and mysterious elements, which is what I really think that they were trying to show in the series. So here's my combined verdict. The Maze Runner works because the central concept is so good. Teenagers wake up with no memories, they're being trapped in a massive maze, they're being hunted by monsters, and someone is also watching them and sending them mysterious food crates and supply crates. And overall, it's a really good series, and the book gives you the mystery, the movie gives you the spectacle, and together they make a surprisingly good introduction to the series. So, but that's also what makes you want to continue. So overall, this is one of the stronger young adult dystopian openings, especially if you enjoy mysteries where the world itself is it's the puzzle. So that's the Maze Runner, both the book and the movie. And the book gives you the mystery of the maze. The movie leaves you with the spectacle, and they both leave you with the terrifying realization that the Gladers weren't randomly trapped there. Someone put them there. Someone has been watching them. The maze has is only the beginning, which means we're definitely not done with this world yet. The next episode is the Scorch Trials, and we'll get into that, what happens when the characters finally leave the maze and discover that the outside world might actually be worse. And of course, we'll compare the second book to the movie because if you thought the first adaptation might change things, the Scorch Trials has a lot to talk to you about, and it's pretty intense. So that's all, guys. Thank you so much for watching. And in the next episode, we're going to be moving on to the second one in the series. So that's all, and bye.